Purpose of this video is to give you a little bit more detail about introductions for writing reports. So a little bit about the structure of the report. In the other video that you viewed for this week, on the IMRED structure, I talked a little bit about this inverted triangle structure. Here I'm going to give you a little bit more detail about what that means. The idea with an introduction is that you start at a general enough level that you're giving the background context to grab the reader and get them to understand what the main topic of the report is. So you want to start out broad enough that you're able to set the scene for the reader, but not so broad that you're doing the sort of since the dawn of time introduction, which isn't really useful to anybody. So you might begin with some statistics. You might start off with general commentary about what's happening around the problem that you're exploring. What does the reader essentially need to know to understand the topic? In this part of the introduction, you might also begin citing some of your sources, which we'll get into in a second about the literature review, but it's where you start to build your credibility and your ethos in that you know what you're talking about for this introduction. The second part of the introduction is essentially where you give the problem statement. I put it in parentheses, this idea of however. First, you create or establish a gap. You talk a little bit about what's been done and what hasn't been done, and this is where your literature review starts to come into play. Here, you persuade your reader that it's a problem, and you give enough information to evaluate that it is indeed a problem that's worth solving. You might also address some of the ways that other people have looked at it or explored the problem and the topic, which is where you pull, again, more of your sources in, and you give the literature review of your problem. You end the introduction very specifically, which is why it's an inverted triangle, because you conclude by the narrowest point. And here you state essentially what your report's purpose is, what it is you're accomplishing, providing an overview of the content of the report. The big key to keep in mind here is that an introduction in this case should be more than one paragraph. So if you find yourself with a one paragraph introduction, that's a little bit of an issue. Before I move on to talking about the literature review, I do want to mention that a lot of times when writers in the sciences are creating an introduction for a report, they actually write it last, or they write it after they write the other sections of the report in terms of, a lot of times people start with the methods and the results. So while I'm requiring you to write the intro first, what I might recommend is that you just sort of sketch out what you might include, and then you come back to it and revise and flesh it out at a later point when you complete the rest of the proposal or the report. So the literature review, what does it do? A lot of times students think the literature review is me summarizing my sources. So it's this sort of, according to source A, blah, blah, blah. According to source B, blah, blah, blah. And that's not really how you want to think about a literature review. Instead, it's an opportunity to outline the problem and talk about what's been said on the topic. And it isn't source by source, but it's instead arranged by topic. So you might very well never say according to whatever source. You might just give a statement and then cite it at the end. The key thing here too is that you probably should avoid quoting your sources extensively. So if you find yourself with a lot of quotations, you want to shift those into paraphrases or cut them out completely, just depending on what you need to do. So again, a process of revision that would work here is that you put in some of those summaries and then you start collapsing them down as you revise. So keep in mind that you're thinking about summarizing on topics, citing them really actively, but avoiding long summaries of individual sources as well as long quotations or any quotations at all. So here's an example we can go through. This is one of the examples provided on Blackboard. And in this introduction, I just kind of want to walk you through the structure here. I'm not saying this introduction is perfect, and in fact it has some flaws that I would have liked to see addressed, but I think it does a couple of things pretty well. So the first thing they do is they begin by talking about Boise and Boise State in connection to the university, because this is actually ends up being part of the problem, is that the university is really large, there's a lot of people enrolled on campus, and the shuttle system is being used for students to get around campus easily and efficiently, and it also provides aid for disabled or injured students to get and faculty to get across campus as well. So it's a great resource on campus. It's really important for a large campus, especially here in Boise. They then narrow in on the main topic that the shuttle is currently unable to accommodate the needs of the population at Boise State. So this is essentially their purpose statement. and then they outline the problem a little bit more. Then after that, they begin their literature review, where they talk about where other universities have handled this issue. So they talk a little bit about these other universities and their shuttle systems and some of the things they do. So they're beginning their literature review, and they're using it as a way of fleshing out the problem, giving some models of what could be done, and how it's setting the scene for the rest of their report. They then dig in a bit more into the problem. They give detail and they connect it to the literature review. So they have some sources there that they're bringing in to continue reviewing it. There's a couple of different ways you can do this, but this is, again, just pulling in information, trying to flesh out the problem and talk about what's been said on the topic. And then their final paragraph, they jump in and really get at the specific goals. They're focusing on advertising the system. They're talking about adding a light and then an app that could do something. So they're essentially giving an overview of what they cover here in the report. This is one of the areas that they could have done a little bit better job of making it clear that this is the focus of the report, is exploring some of these options to improve the efficacy or the effectiveness of the Boise State shuttle system. So just to summarize, keep in mind that introductions set the scene for your report. While sometimes readers do skip them, they are important in that they help you establish your ethos, they provide background and context for the information, and they establish the topic itself. So they give the needed information that a reader might need to know to understand what's going on around a topic, what's been said, why it's a problem that needs addressed, and then what you're planning to do about it in this report. So the other part too is that the literature review explores and expands that context, and it gives what's been said on the topic, and again establishes your ethos as a writer, and then it ends with a good overview of the focus of the report. One of the reasons why you might consider really digging into it after you've completed your methods, results, and discussion sections is that you might find that you need to foreground some of that content with the content in the introduction. So that's just something to keep in mind when you're revising. So I hope that this was helpful to give you a good overview of introductions, and I look forward to seeing your introductions for your report.